The prairie has a way of keeping secrets, holding them under its wide sky until the right moment comes to let them out. That night, the cowboy felt the weight of loneliness, heavier than the worn saddle he carried across the dry earth. He had been riding since dawn, searching for stray cattle, when his horse bolted at the sound of a rattler hiding in the brush. The sudden noise sent the animal charging off into the distance, leaving him stranded with nothing but a bedroll, a rifle, and the dust clinging to his boots. Losing a horse out here wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to a man's survival. Without it, he was cut off from speed, protection, and the only companion that had never turned its back on him. He walked back to camp with the moon rising above him, each step heavy with worry about whether his horse would ever return. The night carried a silence that was almost too sharp. Coyotes sang in the distance, and the fire popped low as the cowboy sat near the flames, staring into the dark. His horse was more than just a mount, it was his lifeline. Out here on the edge of the frontier, men leaned on their horses the way they leaned on their faith. Without one, the vast plains stretched out like a sentence, and every shadow became a reminder of how small and vulnerable a man could be. He tried to convince himself the horse would wander back by dawn, but unease crawled into his bones. He laid his hat over his face and tried to rest, though the stars above seemed too watchful, like they knew something he did not. Sleep came slow, interrupted by dreams of running hooves and flashes of movement across the open land. He dreamed of the horse galloping free, but every time he reached out, it slipped farther away. When he finally woke, the cold air had settled heavy across the camp, and the ashes of the fire whispered into the wind. He rubbed his eyes, half believing he was still lost in a dream, when he heard the faint, steady sound of hooves striking against hard ground. His heart jumped. He rose quickly, scanning the horizon, where the sun had barely begun to rise. Through the morning haze, the shape of his horse appeared. Relief washed over him so strong he nearly shouted. The animal's dark frame grew clearer with each step, head held high as if it had never been gone. Yet something was different. The closer it came, the more he saw the truth. The horse was not alone. On its back sat a figure upright and still, wrapped in the colors of earth and sky. Long black hair streamed down over the shoulders, and the faint glimmer of beads caught the new light. It was a woman, her face unreadable, her presence unexpected, her silence heavier than the wind that swept across the grass. The cowboy froze, every thought in his mind tangled with disbelief. Out here, far from towns and trails, people didn't just appear. The woman sat tall, though her hands gripped the horse's mane rather than the reins, as if she was both strong and weary at once. Her skin carried the warm tone of the desert, and her eyes, sharp yet calm, locked on him without wavering. She was Apache, unmistakably so, and her arrival brought more questions than the cowboy knew how to answer. Why had his horse returned with her? Was she lost, hurt, or leading him into danger? He stood still, the crackling of dry grass beneath the horse's hooves the only sound between them. The horse stopped, just a few feet away, breathing hard, as if it had traveled all night. The woman slid down with a grace that seemed to belong to the land itself. She did not speak at first, and the cowboy found himself caught between relief at having his horse back and the unease of standing before someone whose story was hidden deep behind her gaze. The Apache and the cowboy lived in two different worlds, and in that moment, those worlds collided with the weight of something neither of them had planned. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to ask who she was, what had happened, how his horse had come to carry her. Instead, he only managed a quiet greeting, his voice rough from the night's silence. She gave no answer, only studied him as though measuring whether he was friend or foe. The morning sun stretched higher, lighting the wide plain around them, yet the air between them carried a tension thicker than the shadows before dawn. Every story on the frontier began with a moment like this, a chance meeting that could change everything. The cowboy knew enough about the Apache to understand that trust would not come easy. Stories whispered through saloons and campfires told of raids and revenge. But none of those tales could explain why she now stood before him. Her presence was not an accident. There was a reason his horse had returned with her, and he would have to find out what it was. He noticed the way her clothes were worn, the edges frayed from travel, and the faint mark of dust across her arms as if she had been walking far before finding the horse. Something in her eyes suggested both strength and sorrow, a mixture that unsettled him. She finally broke the silence, her voice low, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. She spoke in words he could barely understand, yet the sound of them tightened his chest.
Oh?
She pointed to the east, toward the distant ridges where the land rose like a wall. The cowboy followed her gesture, though confusion swirled inside him. Was she warning him? Was she asking for help? He didn't know. But he did know one thing: fate had placed them in each other's path for a reason, and out here in the wilderness, reasons always carried consequences. He tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his shoulder, though he did not raise it. He wasn't sure if he needed protection from her, or if she needed protection from something far worse. The horse stood between them, calm yet alert, as though it understood more than either of them did. The cowboy reached out, touching its mane, grounding himself in the familiarity of the animal's presence. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the sudden weight of knowing his life had just shifted. The prairie was no longer empty, and the day ahead promised more than the usual struggle of survival. The woman's eyes held steady on him, waiting, testing, almost daring him to decide what would come next. He could walk away, leave her to the land, take his horse and vanish. But something in her silence told him that choice would follow him forever. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant cry of a hawk. Sharp and haunting, a reminder that nothing on the frontier was ever simple. He swallowed hard, caught between instinct and the unknown, the fire of the morning sun burning across his face. He was a cowboy who had lost his horse, but now he had found something far more complicated. His hand lingered on the reins, the air tense with questions that had no answers yet. The woman shifted her weight, her hand brushing against the beads at her side, her gaze never leaving his. The next word, the next step, the next choice, whatever happened now would decide everything. And before either of them could speak again, the sound of distant hoofbeats rolled across the land, faint but growing, like thunder building behind the hills. The sound of the approaching hoofbeats grew clearer, carrying through the stillness of the morning air. The cowboy's eyes darted to the horizon, where the sun now revealed the shapes of distant riders moving fast across the open land. He could not yet tell who they were, but his chest tightened with unease. Out on the frontier, riders rarely came without reason, and often that reason carried trouble. His hand shifted instinctively to the rifle slung across his shoulder, though he did not lift it. The Apache woman's gaze followed the distant figures, her face calm but her jaw set with something sharp, as though she already knew what was coming. The cowboy wanted to speak, to ask her if she recognized the riders, but her silence held him back. She was not afraid in the way a stranger might be. Instead, she stood grounded, her eyes unblinking, her breath steady. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment. The horse between them pawed at the earth, uneasy, its ears flicking toward the sound. The cowboy patted its neck, whispering soft words, though his own nerves betrayed him. The riders were still far enough away that their faces could not be seen, but their number was clear. At least 5, maybe more, spread across the plain like shadows moving toward them. The cowboy had been around enough to know the signs of a group that rode with purpose. These men weren't drifting aimlessly. They were tracking something or someone. He turned his eyes back to the woman, her hands pressed against the leather pouch at her side, and she finally spoke again, her words low and broken with pauses. Understood only pieces, but the meaning struck deep. She was not simply a traveler who had found his horse. She was running, and the riders in the distance were hunting. His mind churned. He had stumbled into something larger than himself, and now he had to decide whether to walk away or stand in the middle of a conflict that wasn't his. The plains had their own code, and every man learned it if he wanted to last. Sometimes that code meant lending a hand, even when it pulled you into danger. Yet another part of him knew that the wisest choice was often to turn your back before the trouble reached you. The woman's eyes shifted back to him, searching for an answer, though she said nothing more. Her silence carried as much weight as words could. The cowboy's heart beat hard against his chest as he watched the riders grow closer. He could see the faint trail of dust their horses kicked up, glowing gold in the rising light. Whoever they were, they would soon be upon them. He stepped back, glancing around the land. There was no cover here, no canyon wall to hide against, no thick woods to slip into. The prairie lay open, offering no secrets except the tall grass that bent with the wind. If it came to a standoff, there would be no place to disappear. The woman reached out suddenly, her hand brushing against the reins of his horse. It was a small gesture, but it told him she was not planning to flee without him. She could have taken the horse and vanished before he even woke, yet she had come to him instead. That choice puzzled him, and deep inside, it stirred something he could not yet name. He remembered the years he had spent drifting from one job to the next, driving cattle, guarding wagons, watching over land that wasn't his. He had known men who lived only for themselves, and he had known men who died because they trusted too easily. But he had never known what it felt like to stand on the edge of a moment that could change everything. The riders slowed as they drew near, still keeping their distance. Dust rolled behind them, blurring their shapes, but he could now make out their outlines: hats low, rifles slung, horses restless. They hadn't rushed forward, which told him they weren't ready to strike without taking a closer look. That gave him time, but not much. The woman took a step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper he could barely hear. Though her words were not fully clear to him, he caught enough to understand. She spoke of danger, of men who would not stop, of the need for trust. The cowboy's throat tightened. He had spent much of his life alone, never trusting anyone fully, not even the men who shared his campfires. And now, this stranger, this Apache woman, was asking for something he rarely gave. His fingers brushed the worn stock of his rifle, did not raise it yet, but his mind weighed the choices. If these men came looking for her, they might not care who stood in their way. If he handed her over, he could keep his life simple, return to his path, pretend the morning had been nothing more than a strange dream. But if he stood by her side, then whatever fate chased her would soon be chasing him too. The horse shifted, nudging his shoulder, as if urging him to decide. The cowboy took a deep breath, his eyes flicking between the riders and the woman. He saw no fear in her, only determination, and that unsettled him more than anything else. People with nothing left to lose often carried a fire that could not be put out. The hoofbeats slowed to a stop about 50 yards away. The riders formed a loose line, their horses stamping at the earth, their eyes fixed on the pair standing alone in the open. One of them lifted a hand in a gesture that could mean greeting or warning. The cowboy did not move. He waited, the silence stretching long, broken only by the restless snorts of horses on both sides. The woman stood firm beside him, her shoulders square, her chin lifted. Whatever her story was, it was far from finished, and now he was tied to it whether he wanted to be or not. The riders had not yet spoken, and the air between them carried the kind of tension that could break at the slightest spark. The cowboy's heart pounded as he kept his eyes locked on the approaching men, the weight of the rifle pressing against his shoulder. He didn't know if these men carried law or lawlessness, but he did know one thing: once words were spoken, there would be no turning back. The morning sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the grasslands. The wind stilled for a moment, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what choice would be made. The cowboy stood silent, the Apache woman at his side, and the riders across from them. Every eye locked, every breath counted. And then, one rider slowly nudged his horse forward, breaking the stillness of the plain. The lead rider came forward at an easy pace, though the way his horse moved told the cowboy this man was no stranger to speed or force when the moment called for it. The others stayed back, their faces half hidden under broad hats, rifles angled across their saddles. Dust clung to their coats, and the smell of leather and sweat reached the cowboy even across the distance. He steadied his breath, his hand brushing against the smooth wood of his rifle, but he kept it lowered. The woman beside him did not flinch. She stood tall, her gaze sharp, as though she knew these men and expected them. The rider stopped a few yards short. His eyes, dark and narrow, studied the cowboy first before sliding to the Apache woman. He said nothing at first, letting silence weigh heavy, testing them. The cowboy had been in enough standoffs to know that silence was often a weapon. The longer it stretched, the more it pressed down on the chest. Finally, the rider spoke, his voice low and deliberate. He asked about the woman, his tone carrying more demand than question. The cowboy didn't answer right away. He wanted to know what the man really wanted before giving anything away. The woman's hand brushed against her pouch again, her shoulders tense. She did not speak, but her eyes flashed, a warning he could not ignore. Whoever these men were, they were not here to offer kindness. The cowboy cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. He said the horse had wandered back to him at sunrise with her on its back. Nothing more, nothing less. The rider's jaw tightened, as if he did not believe him, though he gave no sign of moving closer. Behind him, the others shifted, their horses stamping the ground, eager and restless. One leaned forward, muttering something the cowboy could not catch, but the tone was sharp enough to know it wasn't good. The lead rider raised a hand, silencing him, his eyes still locked on the woman. He spoke again, saying she was theirs, that she had no business with the cowboy. The words came like iron, heavy and certain, meant to leave no room for argument. The cowboy's chest burned with unease. Part of him wanted to hand her over, let them take her, and walk away before blood spilled on the open plain. Yet another part of him bristled at the idea. The woman had not begged for help, but her presence carried a plea stronger than any words. She had chosen not to flee when she had the chance, and something about that choice told him she was caught in something deeper than these men wanted to admit. The horse shifted beneath his hand, sensing the weight of the moment. He glanced at the woman. Her expression had not changed, but her eyes spoke volumes. She would not go willingly, and if he'd let them take her, he would never shake the image from his mind. The rider leaned forward in his saddle, repeating the demand with sharper force. The cowboy tightened his grip on the reins. He could feel the moment tipping, the balance fragile. If he refused, the riders would not ride away peacefully. If he agreed, he might never forgive himself. The silence stretched again, thick as storm clouds. Finally, the cowboy spoke, his voice steady, though his heart pounded. He said she was free to decide for herself. The words hung in the air like sparks waiting to catch flame. The rider's face darkened, his horse pawing the earth. The men behind him stirred, shifting in their saddles, muttering curses. The woman stepped slightly forward, her chin high, her eyes unyielding. The lead rider's hand twitched toward his rifle, but he didn't draw. Not yet. He studied the cowboy, perhaps measuring whether this was a man willing to bleed for a stranger. The cowboy's mind raced. He thought of all the years behind him, the nights spent alone by a fire, the trails he had followed with nothing but dust for company. He had walked through towns where men looked the other way when trouble came. He had always told himself he was different. But here was the test, staring him in the face. Before the moment could tip into violence, a sound broke through the tension, the distant cry of a horn echoing across the ridges. Every head turned, even the horses pausing at the unfamiliar noise. The riders exchanged glances, their leader stiffening. The woman's eyes widened ever so slightly, and for the first time, the cowboy saw something close to fear flicker across her face. The horn sounded again, sharper, closer. It carried a warning, though he did not know from whom. The riders cursed under their breath, shifting uneasily. The leader pulled his reins, turning his horse slightly toward the sound. He spat into the dust, then fixed his eyes once more on the cowboy and the woman. He said this wasn't over, that they would return, and when they did, there would be no second chances. With that, he yanked his horse around and the others followed, galloping off in a storm of dust that rolled across the plain. The cowboy stood still, the echoes of their hoofbeats fading into the distance. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath heavy. He looked at the woman, who now let out a slow exhale, her shoulders easing only slightly. The horn's cry lingered in his ears, raising more questions than answers. Who had sounded it, and why had it made those riders turn away? The woman finally spoke, her voice low, each word carrying weight. He caught fragments. Enemy, pursuit, danger. She pointed again toward the ridges, the same direction she had pointed before. He realized she wanted to go there, though he still didn't know what waited beyond. He studied her, torn between curiosity and caution. If he followed her, he would be walking deeper into a conflict he did not understand. Yet if he stayed, those riders would surely return, and next time, they would not ride away so easily. The day stretched before them, the sun climbing high, the land shimmering with heat. The cowboy packed his bedroll and slung it over his horse, his mind restless. The woman waited in silence, her patience unshaken. Finally he nodded, a small gesture that sealed his choice. He would ride with her at least far enough to learn the truth. They set off together, the horse steady beneath them, the plain stretching endless. The cowboy felt the weight of unseen eyes on them, as though the land itself was watching.
Us.
His thoughts wandered to the riders, their words sharp with possession. Why had they claimed the woman? What had she done to them, or what had they done to her? As they rode, he caught glimpses of her expression, the quiet strength that never left her face. She was not merely running for her life, she was carrying something with her, something more important than her own safety. He thought of the pouch she kept close, the way her hand never strayed far from it. Whatever it held, it was worth enough to make men chase her across the wilderness. By midday, the ridges loomed closer, their jagged edges cutting against the sky. The cowboy knew they offered shelter, but also traps. Many had ridden into such country and never come back. The woman urged the horse onward, her eyes locked on the rising stone. He followed, though unease gnawed at him with each step. The wind shifted, carrying faint sounds he could not place, whispers of movement, the echo of hooves far behind. He turned in the saddle, scanning the horizon. Nothing clear, only the shimmer of heat. Still, the feeling did not leave him. Someone was following. He said nothing, not wanting to show doubt, but his hand rested near his rifle as they rode. The woman seemed to sense it too. She lifted her gaze to the ridges, her jaw set, her eyes narrowing with resolve. The cowboy knew then that whatever lay ahead would not be simple. He had stepped into a story bigger than his own, and the conflict now wrapped around them like the rising heat. The riders would return. The horn's cry hinted at another force moving across the land. And in the middle of it all was this woman, her secrets bound tight, her strength unbroken. The horse carried them steadily toward the ridges, each step echoing with questions. The cowboy's chest tightened as he realized the truth. He had not only found his horse again, he had found the beginning of something that would test every ounce of grit he had left. And as the shadow of the ridges swallowed them, the faint sound of hoofbeats drifted once more across the plain. It's closer now, following fast. The ridges rose before them like the walls of some ancient fortress. Jagged stone cutting into the horizon, their shadows stretching long across the prairie. The cowboy guided his horse toward a narrow path that wound between the rocks, his eyes scanning every edge. The Apache woman sat behind him, steady, her silence pressing harder than words. He felt her hand tighten slightly on the back of the saddle, as if even she knew this ground carried more than stone and sand. He had ridden enough trails to know when a place was dangerous, and these ridges whispered danger with every gust of wind. The sound of hoofbeats still haunted the air behind them. Sometimes faint, sometimes stronger, never close enough to see, but always present, like ghost riding just out of reach. The cowboy's gut told him the men they had seen earlier were not far. They had let him and the woman slip away once, but men like that never gave up, kept one hand near his rifle, the other gripping the reins, every muscle in his body tense as they climbed higher into the rocks. The path narrowed until the horse had to move single file, hooves striking sparks against stone. The woman leaned forward slightly, pointing toward a cluster of boulders that jutted out like a broken wall. Her voice came low, urging him to follow. He hesitated, glancing back toward the open plain, then turned the horse into the passage. The air cooled as the rocks closed around them, shadows swallowing the light of day. Inside the ridges, the world grew quieter, though not calmer. The cowboy could hear every drip of water trickling down stone, every echo of their horses' steps bouncing through the narrow walls. It was the kind of silence that made a man's skin crawl, because it gave the impression of being watched. He stole a glance at the woman. Her eyes searched the rocks with the focus of someone who knew this land, but even she carried a tightness in her jaw that spoke of unease. They pressed deeper until the passage opened into a small hollow where the earth dipped low, hidden from the wide prairie. Here, the woman slid down from the horse, her feet landing softly on the ground. She walked ahead, her hand brushing the stone, as if remembering something. The cowboy dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against loose gravel, tied the reins loosely to a low branch jutting from the rock, though the horse tossed its head uneasy. The woman crouched near a cluster of brush growing between stones, pulling it aside. The cowboy stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he saw what she revealed. A narrow crack in the rock, just wide enough for a person to slip through. She gestured for him to follow. He hesitated, the thought of stepping into such a tight place making his chest tighten, but the sound of distant hoofbeats carried faintly once again through the wind. That was enough to push him forward. Inside the crack, the air turned colder, damp with the smell of earth and stone. The path wound downward, twisting like the throat of a canyon, until it opened into a cavern faintly lit by a shaft of sunlight cutting through the ceiling.
Ow.
The cowboy stopped short, his breath caught. Painted across the stone walls were markings, symbols drawn in red and black, faded with time yet powerful in their presence. The woman stood before them, her hand brushing lightly over one of the symbols, her face solemn. He realized then that this place meant something to her. Perhaps it was sacred, perhaps a refuge, perhaps both. He didn't understand the markings, but he understood the weight they carried. This was no accident. She had led him here for a reason. Before he could speak, the faint echo of voices drifted through the passage behind them. The riders had followed, their sound carried by the stone. The cowboy's heart hammered. They were cornered. He turned sharply, gripping his rifle, his eyes fixed on the narrow entrance. He could hear the scrape of boots on stone, the muffled snort of horses waiting outside. The woman placed her hand on his arm, steady, her eyes locked on his. She shook her head once, then motioned deeper into the cavern. He wanted to argue, to stand and fight, but something in her gaze told him that fighting here would only end one way. He followed as she led him toward a darker passage that bent sharply to the left, hidden from the sunlight. The air grew tighter, pressing in around them, until the walls opened again into another hollow chamber. Here the cowboy noticed something he had missed before. Bundle rested against the far wall, wrapped in hide, tied with cord. The woman dropped to her knees beside it, her hands working quickly to check the knots. She pulled it close, her eyes softening for the first time since he had met her. Whatever was inside, it was what those riders were after. The cowboy crouched beside her, his voice low. He asked her what it was, though he knew she might not answer. She looked at him, her eyes fierce but sad, and said one word he could understand, clear enough: safe. That was all. Safe. The echo of boots grew louder, bouncing through the cavern, closer with each breath. The cowboy raised his rifle, aiming at the passage, every muscle tight. He could see shadows flickering against the stone, hear the voices grow sharper. The woman clutched the bundle to her chest, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes burning with defiance. The cowboy's mind raced. There was no way out except the passage the riders were coming through. He thought of the horse outside, restless and alone. He thought of the open plains, freedom just beyond the stone. He thought of the choice he had made that morning when he refused to hand her over. Now there was no turning back. The first rider appeared at the mouth of the passage, his rifle in hand, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He froze when he saw them, shouting back to the others. The cowboy lifted his rifle higher, his breath steady, his finger brushing the trigger. The cavern trembled with tension, the air heavy with the promise of violence. The woman's hand pressed against the bundle, her eyes closing for a moment, as if she were whispering to something inside. When she opened them again, they were sharp, ready. The cowboy felt the moment coiled tight, like a rattlesnake ready to strike. More riders crowded the passage, their shadows stretching long across the cavern walls. The cowboy shifted his feet, grounding himself, his eyes locked on the lead man. He could hear the woman's breath steady behind him, feel the weight of her presence. The leader stepped forward, his voice echoing against the stone. He demanded the bundle, his words sharp as knives, said if they handed it over, no one needed to die. The cowboy didn't believe him for a second. Men like this didn't ride across miles of prairie to speak of mercy. The air grew thick, every second stretching long. The cowboy's finger hovered on the trigger. The riders poised, the woman clutching the bundle with fire in her eyes. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the echoes of the plains outside gone, leaving only the storm about to break. And in that breathless stillness, just as the riders began to advance, the sound of another horn split the air.
Ow.
Louder and nearer than before, its cry rattling the very stone around them. The horn's cry tore through the cavern like thunder, shaking the air and sending dust tumbling from the cracks above. The riders froze where they stood, their eyes flicking toward the passage they had just come through. The cowboy held his rifle steady, though his pulse hammered. The woman clutched the bundle tighter, her face lit by a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. Another horn sounded closer, and with it came the unmistakable roar of many hoofbeats outside the ridges. Whoever had blown that signal was coming fast, and they weren't coming alone. The riders in the cavern cursed under their breath. The leader barked orders, motioning for 2 men to hold the passage while the others turned, preparing to retreat. For a moment, the cowboy thought they might try to take the woman and her bundle by force before the newcomers arrived. He braced himself, ready for the first shot. But then the leader's eyes narrowed, and he spat into the dust, snarling that this wasn't finished. He backed out slowly, never turning his back, his gaze locked on the cowboy as if carving the memory of him into stone. One by one, the riders pulled out of the cavern, their boots and rifles clattering against the stone. The echoes of their retreat mixed with the horn's cry until the sound filled every corner of the ridges. The cowboy lowered his rifle slightly, but did not let go. He knew men like that, they weren't running away for good. They were only regrouping. The woman's shoulders eased, and she let out a long breath. She set the bundle on her lap and pulled at the ties, unwrapping it slowly. The cowboy leaned closer, curiosity pushing through his nerves. Inside lay a small child, no more than 4 or 5, his face smudged with dust, his eyes wide but calm. The boy blinked at the sudden light, clutching at the woman's arm. The cowboy felt his chest tighten. All the pieces fell into place at once. The woman hadn't just been fleeing for herself. She had been carrying her child, hidden away in the ridges, where she hoped no one could find him. The boy's gaze met the cowboy's, unafraid, almost curious. The cowboy swallowed hard, his rifle lowering to his side. He understood now why she had clung to the pouch, why she had refused to speak much, why the riders had pursued her so fiercely. They weren't after her alone. They wanted the child, though for what reason he could only guess. The horn blasted again, this time so close the ground beneath them trembled. Then came shouts, voices echoing against stone, not the coarse shouts of the riders, but deeper, stronger, carrying the rhythm of warriors. The woman's face shifted, her eyes lighting with recognition. She rose quickly, clutching the boy, and moved toward the entrance. The cowboy followed, rifle in hand, though his chest filled with unease. As they stepped back into the sunlight of the hollow, he saw them Apache riders sweeping through the ridges, their horses swift, their cries carrying sharp through the air. Spears gleamed in the light, bows strung tight, rifles raised. They moved with the force of a storm, surrounding the canyon mouth where the riders who had chased them now scrambled in retreat. The horn had been their signal, a call to gather. The cowboy watched as the 2 groups clashed at the base of the ridges. Dust boiled upward, cries and gunfire cutting through the air. The riders who had threatened them were no match for the wave of warriors that descended. In moments, the fight spilled out onto the plains, carried farther and farther away until only faint echoes remained. Silence settled again in the hollow, broken only by the restless snorts of horses. The cowboy turned to the woman, who stood holding her child close. Several Apache men rode toward them, dismounting quickly. Their faces carried both relief and sternness as they spoke in low tones with the woman. She answered quietly, her voice steady despite all that had passed. The cowboy stepped back, suddenly aware of how out of place he was. He had no claim here, no blood tie, no right to linger among them. Yet before he could slip away, the woman turned to him. She stepped closer, her eyes holding his, gratitude shining clear, though her words were few. She placed her hand briefly on his arm, a gesture that carried more weight than any speech could. He nodded, tipping his hat slightly, unsure how else to answer. He felt a strange heaviness in his chest, not of fear, but of something harder to name. In all his years wandering, drifting from trail to trail, he had never expected to be drawn into something that mattered more than himself. He had saved his horse, yes, but more than that, he had stood beside a woman and her child when it counted. The Apache warriors helped the woman mount her horse, the boy held safely against her. She did not look away from the cowboy until the last moment, her gaze steady, as though silently telling him that this story was not something either of them would forget. Then she turned, riding with her people toward the ridges where the sun glowed bright against the stone. The cowboy stood alone in the hollow, his horse waiting patiently beside him. The land stretched wide and endless once again, but it felt different now. The silence was no longer the heavy kind that pressed against his chest. It was a quiet filled with memory, with the knowledge that sometimes the prairie chose a man, setting him in the path of something greater than his own wandering. He ran a hand along the horse's neck, the familiar comfort grounding him. The animal snorted softly, as if to remind him that no matter how far he roamed, the land would always test him, always push him toward choices that revealed the man he was. He mounted slowly, turning his gaze east, where the woman and her people had disappeared. For a long while he sat watching the horizon, the rising dust slowly settling back into the earth. When at last he turned his horse toward the open plains, he carried no answers to the questions that still lingered: why those riders wanted the woman and child, what future awaited them, whether he would ever cross paths with them again. But he carried something else instead, something he had not felt in years. A sense of purpose, of knowing that even a drifter's life could leave behind more than dust. The sun climbed higher, the sky stretching endless, and the cowboy rode steady, the rhythm of hooves, a reminder that the journey never truly ended. Somewhere behind him, the ridges held the echoes of horns and voices, the memory of a morning that had changed the course of more than one life. And as he disappeared back into the wide frontier, he knew he would never again think of himself as just a man chasing cattle or guarding trails. He was the cowboy who had lost his horse and found it again, carrying more than he ever expected. He had been pulled into a story of survival, family, and courage. And though he rode alone once more, the memory of the woman and her child stayed with him, etched as deeply into his heart as the markings painted on the cavern walls. The land would go on keeping its secrets, but he carried one of them now, and it would ride with him for the rest of his days.